Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to another Tuesday talk show. So this one is going to be quite late since I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do for a subject of this one. In the end, I decided to talk a little bit about the sort of writing paradigm of show don't tell, and kind of also why I don't really read very many more modern books all that often. I still read quite a lot, but I don't really particularly like most of the books written in the current day because a lot of them follow that rule, and I find that that's actually not really all that entertaining to me. The reason I want to talk about this is because I'm trying to finish off the last chapter of my horror story. You can find it on my blog if you want to check it out a little bit. I've been working on it for a very long time, and I've technically speaking finished it like 7 or 8 times, or 5 or 7 times, I don't really remember, but I keep deleting the ending because I don't like the way that it's gone, and I want to rewrite it, but I do want to finish it by this Halloween in particular, so I figured that talking about writing is going to help motivate me a little bit. But I also want to talk about this because it's another way in which I analyze and look at literature, and also how I look at the way games and stuff like that, and how the story sort of develops in those particular cases. Now, show don't tell is the general idea that when you're writing something or crafting a story of any particular sort, it's better for you to have some sort of description of events unfolding, or of details, or outside stimuli like, say, sounds or smells or images that would be evocative of the particular information that you're trying to imply. It's also possible to do it slightly more directly, but generally speaking, the way that you're supposed to show is by putting actual descriptions of in-story things happening that would tell you what has to be in play for that to be the case. Generally speaking, this works best for stories that are focusing on small, intimate details of things that are close at hand. As you get broader and broader in scope of things, it starts to wear a little bit thin because you sort of have to make these massive assumptions about larger, more complex systems. So generally speaking, this is going to work best in scenarios where you can talk about fairly simple things happening in close proximity to the characters that you're going to be using as the point of view for this particular instance. Now, to tell something is to simply say what is happening, and this can happen from 2 different sources. In-character exposition is where the character dialogue is designed and crafted specifically to give information. So while you technically are using dialogue, which is an in-character thing, this stuff sort of leans on the fourth wall a little bit. And this is the kind that I think really can ruin a good book. Is when there's really poorly done character exposition, where they're talking to one another and they sort of lean a little bit too heavily on that. It's like, why would these people be talking about that as a common complaint for this type of exposition? The other type is when the narrator is giving you exposition, and if you've got an omnipotent narrator, or omniscient rather narrator, then you can use this type of exposition where the narrator simply explains it to you. And this has a lot less pitfalls because the narrator already exists outside of the story under most circumstances if they're the omniscient type of narrator. If they're an unreliable narrator, that can also be interesting for exposition, because you can sort of weave in these sort of lies into that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So I think that that is a sort of stronger way of using that mechanic, in particular in horror. I find that having an unreliable narrator that's capable of outright lying while expositing facts to you is one of those tools that you can actually use to set ideas and atmosphere that you can't in other mediums. Now, part of this is that the book is a written medium. You can't infer information in the same way that you could from film or from even paintings or something like that. You can draw expressions, you can draw, or you can have an actor act out a certain emotion and make it sort of that you're showing that. What books are better at is getting into the internal mind of a mental state of a person. For a movie, if you want to convey that somebody is panicking, you have to sort of show that on the character's face there. How do you show someone panicking internally when they're actually a very cool, methodical person, and they're capable of keeping that bottled up and keeping that invisible to someone outside of them? That's much, much harder in something like a movie, but it's very possible in something like a book, where you're capable of either creating an internal monologue that's explaining their internal mental state, or you're capable of simply explaining that through the omniscience of the narrator. So this is just one of those things that books are capable of doing. They're capable of explaining or expositing this kind of internal information that's impossible for other people to know, and they're capable of using a narrator without it seeming very clunky, because if you're watching a movie and that movie has a narrator and they're constantly interjecting things as often as they would in a book, for instance, it's a little bit clunky. It doesn't sound very natural and it takes you away from the experience, but that isn't true when you're reading a book. Or being even told a story. I find that the way that we sort of format books in terms of the narrator is that it's almost as though someone is sitting there with you telling the story to you, and that's how you would take that sort of narrator. And that doesn't make sense in the context of something like a movie. You don't have a movie told to you by somebody, but a book is told to you by somebody, essentially by the narrator. If you could have like a living person sitting there beside you, it's the sort of thing that would happen when they're talking about the story, and maybe someone pipes in, it's like, well, why is it like that? Well, then he could exposit the information for those people. So I think that you can get to the point here in saying that I'm not really a big fan of the rule or the guideline of show, don't tell. And there's a lot of different complex reasons why I'm not really a big fan of that being a general rule of thumb or even a guideline. I think that there is definitely a place for people to use the show mechanic instead of telling, but I at the same time think that just telling is a simple mechanic that you should be able to use for a lot of situations. And I think that even better writers both show and tell to sort of strengthen an idea or a concept, and they can generally do so while avoiding redundancies, because yeah, it's pretty bad if you fully show something and then fully tell it as well. That just doubles the amount of writing. Well, not quite doubles, but increases the amount of writing that you would have to do otherwise for a point that the reader hopefully has already gotten. But if it's a really important one and you need to really hammer that home, then that can be a useful a tool there. And I think that one of the big issues that people sort of have with it is that there is a lot of poorly written exposition out there. If exposition is flat and dull and boring, then it's not going to come across as something that you want in your story. So that kind of exposition, sure, but that doesn't mean that you have to write exposition in that particular way. There are writers who write huge amounts of exposition into their stories when you could have done the other mechanism of showing instead. That exposition is usually very entertaining in its own right. I find that a lot of, for example, British authors lean heavily on very interesting exposition. If you read Tolkien, he does a lot of showing. He describes the sights, the smells, the sort of ambience of any given scenario, but he also is willing to tell you a lot about the world that you're sort of reading about and engaging in. So he does quite a lot of both. And just outright tells you about the history, tells you who so-and-so a person is, tells you where such and such a place is, tells you what the map is like, tells you what the weather is like or whatever. And this works quite well, I think, in just sort of breaking up the sort of tone there. People say that he already spends way too long describing the scenery and so on and so forth. Well, he's showing you the scenery to give you a really thorough picture of what the place looks like. If he didn't have some significant amounts of exposition also in there, that would just be an entire book of describing how trees look. Another example would be someone like Douglas Adams. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is entirely set around an encyclopedia, essentially, and or a travel guide, as it were. And most of the story comes with these sort of segues or these asides from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy itself, where it's just basically a long string of very, very funny exposition where they're explaining this is what this is to you. This is what it does and this is where it's from. And then it usually explains that while technically speaking the narrator is omniscient, he's reporting from something that is very, very much not omniscient, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy itself, which is an unreliable source of information. So you're kind of getting that double layers of narration there. Often to very, very humorous effect. And yes, there is lots of parts that are just described in sort of detail to you, but it's still, like, how do you convey the information of, like, a nuclear missile just randomly turning into a potted plant? You basically have to just say the missile turned into a potted plant. I'm not really sure how you could go about really showing that as opposed to telling that that's what happened. Because, again, it works best for simple concepts and simple ideas. A missile transmogrifying into a potted plant it is much less easy to convey through showing. And not only that, it's a lot less humorous than simply saying that that's what happened in a lot of senses. It's a great anticlimax, and I think that to a certain extent, if you're going to write British humor, anticlimax is one of those things that they do very well, where there's a lot of this build-up, a lot of showing, a lot of big pivotal sort of scenes there, and then suddenly just they tell you that something very, very bland happened instead, and it's just like, wow, that killed everything. And you sort of get a laugh out of that. But I guess, I don't know, I just might have a different sense of humor as far as that goes, because I do love those sorts of scenes there. And another example would, of course, be Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett's sort of like a mix between the two, in that he writes these sort of long notes of exposition in the ledgers of his books, and you're supposed to sort of read those as a companion to his books there. And not just that, but his characters have very fourth wall leaning exposition, where they're explaining things that obviously it's like, why are you explaining that to me? And they might even discuss that sort of thing to one another. But generally speaking, his work is extremely exposition heavy. But despite that, the dialogue, the characters, all of that's set in such a way that it never really takes you out of the story, because they're all inherently silly people doing very, very silly things. And when they sort of describe it, it generally sort of emphasizes that kind of humor. And of course, all of the asides are brilliantly written as well. So the problem isn't exposition in and of itself, and certainly the idea that exposition is boring is, in my opinion, a complete myth. It's probably more akin to saying that it's preference. But the reality is that you have to be able to write exposition well. So this leads me a little bit into why I don't read modern stories all that often anymore. A lot of modern writers do follow, I find, the advice of just to make your story better, don't add in exposition and follow these other sort of rules. But what never really ends up happening is, like, they don't learn how to make the story itself more interesting. They learn how to cut out things that are considered or deemed weak by mass opinion or by some literary theorists or by some other people. But what they don't learn is how to make their dialogue interesting instead. Like, they've cut out the exposition and replaced it with some sort of descriptive event of showing the flow of events there. It's more actiony, it's more fast-paced, it's more snappy, it's a little bit lengthier, padding it out a little bit, but it's not exposition. And the assumption is supposed to be, well, is that really going to make it better? Not necessarily. A much more talented writer would just be like, well, just write better exposition. Like, why can't you just do that? I mean, yeah, they will also cut out exposition and replace it with showing when that's appropriate. But I think that a smarter writer, instead of saying don't use exposition, is going to say that, well, if this scene I think works better with exposition, so learn to write it better. That's what they're going to say. And instead, people have been using things like show don't tell as a crutch. They've been assuming that, like, oh yeah, well, this book doesn't have a lot of exposition in it, so it's good, so we'll publish it. So instead of these writers where they're better at writing, we're getting writers that are better at following a formula, essentially. And this is kind of why I don't like these. I don't mind formulaic writing to a certain degree. One of my favorite genres is actually the mystery novels, so I read a lot of Agatha Christie. I've read a lot of Sherlock Holmes. Those books are fairly formulaic in a great sense there, but at the same time, I don't mind those sorts of books there. But their writing style isn't following someone else's formula. Arthur Conan Doyle writes to his formula. R.L. Stine wrote to his formula. Agatha Christie wrote to her formula. Each of these writers had their unique tone and style to it, and it may or may not incorporate large amounts of exposition. What they did do is learn how to make their story fit with whether or not they're going to show or tell, and to vary it up and to use both of those elements as is appropriate. And honestly speaking, there are legitimately just times where it is better to tell instead of to show. So anyway, this is going to be a fairly short episode there. That's pretty much all I had to say on the matter. I hope it gives you a better sort of insight into the way I view literature and maybe the way that I review things. But I hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.